Lesson 11. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. And then it expanded into, like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art. Toni Morrison wrote those words. And we're going to use that to actually jump into what is, I think, the most important lesson, which is, what does it mean to actually make a work in your own time that you actually care about? All these lessons are meaningless if you don't have the inspiration to actually want to sit down and make something, right? And the part about chaos can lead to wisdom in art is sometimes you don't have to know what it is you want to make. You can just start to make something, and you will find through the making what you're interested in. So let's look at a few examples for today. This is Chardin. In the 1700s, Chardin was considered an incredible painter, and he got into the Guild of Painting, and he was so good he could choose any level of painting. And that time you would pick your level and you would kind of be pigeonholed in it. He chose the lowest level, which was still life. And within that level, he chose painting stuff in the kitchen, which would be considered even the lowest of the low. So what he did, though, was he was capturing the time and the time that it took to sit and look. We can go back to that Leaves of Grass quote. And just light. It's just, incredible paintings. One can make the argument incredibly political. In the late 1800s, Jericho made what many consider one of the first paintings about a contemporaneous moment in time, a very charged moment. This is depicting when a French frigate ran aground off the coast of Senegal while they were colonizing Senegal. And the very wealthy escaped and everyone else was left to die. So you can see he used all the formal issues, the triangles, and then you have this person of color who's the only one really who's looking off into the horizon, into the future. Think back to that Mark Strand lecture. And very hard to see, but back there's a ship, and we'll never know if this ship actually sees them or not. So is it hope or hopelessness? The other things to think about how you make a work. Jericho, he actually built a life-size model in his studio. He got cadaver parts, he would lay them out, and he would paint from them. This is Delacroix who was modeled for him. So he shaved his head which was socially unacceptable at the time, so he couldn't go to parties, and he would just stay and work on the painting. In the 60s, Philip Guston became a very famous painter for these abstract expressionist, very personal paintings. And though when the 70s came around, he famously talked about how feeling schizophrenic in his studio because he was so charged by what was happening on the streets in the world, and yet he was trying to reconcile that with when he came into his studio and what it meant to think about changing a red to a green. And he made these incredible Nixon drawings, this whole suite of drawings that he followed Nixon. He first showed them at the Norfolk Summer School, which I used to run for a long time. He called after midnight and showed them to the students, the first place they were ever shown because he was afraid Nixon was following him. Incredible drawings. They inspired my years of the Cock animations. Now we're going to jump to Jack Whitten. Jack Whitten is an incredible artist who talked about that the only freedom he could find was in his studio. And he also talked about how in the late 60s, early 70s, someone came to his studio and said, "Oh, Jack, you got a lot of nice de Koonings here." And he looked around and he realized, yeah, I do. And so he really tried to then figure out how he could make his own work. So what Jack did was he wanted to realize he was using all of de Kooning's brushes, his paints, the same things. And so he tried to look into himself and to figure out what he had. And he took his own Afro comb and he built actually these giant tools that he would then drag across the painting. He talked about wanting to make one indelible mark, paintings out of one stroke. And so he made these, and he was very particular. He talked about how he would carve the spokes into a certain length and so he could drag them through. You really need to check out both his writings and his paintings. There it is. This is David Hammons, who I think of as like the Whitman of our times. Whitman wrote, "I celebrate myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you." That idea of the indexical being for everyone. So Hammons made these drawings in the early 70s where he would put grease or margarine on his body or on his clothes, and then he would press himself into paper. Yves Klein had done this, but he used models, right? He used women and put blue paint on them. Hammonds was using himself, and everything he makes seems both so poetic and so political. Glenn Ligon made this first a painting in 1988, appropriating the posters from the sanitation workers strike that Martin Luther King organized in 1968 in Memphis. And so here is a real example of the painting originally. Glenn Ligon talks about that he used two kinds of paints that didn't really dry well together, so they would crack, and it would kind of embody this history. And he talked about how for a long time it just sat around his studio. And then he got inspired by this idea of a condition report. And so he took a scan of his painting and he sent it to a conservator and had a condition report. And that became actually a new work. So this idea that something can sit around and ferment and become more, this idea that this condition of his own work is actually now like looking at like looking at the Whitman quote of being everyman. Whitman famously took the pose in the beginning. He had an etching made of himself as an everyman journeyer, which isn't the way he dressed, but he wanted to actually have this persona be for everyone. So what you need to think about is what drives you to make a work. It might be just to slow down and draw the perfect egg with maybe a 9H pencil that will take you 12 hours to build up the values and the light. Maybe it's that idea of just observing a spear of summer grass, right? This idea of looking like a Chardin. Maybe it's like a Hammond or a Jack Whitten of finding your own tool to make something. Maybe it's you use that as a way to draw, right? So now you have that line. And then maybe you use this to actually find something. And then maybe I could take that and I could think about the Toni Morrison about chaos, and I could start to think. And I could think, okay, I've been looking at this pencil for all these weeks, kind of the power, and then I could look at my own hand, and I could think, what does it mean to have a pencil, to hold a pencil, and making kind of like the ant, like a symbol. And then what if I put this pencil in a little rowboat? And then I put it on top of a waterfall? What does that mean, right? Maybe now through just slowly you make a mark, you follow it through, you think about what means something to you. Okay. Find something you want to draw. I recommend reading Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, which is all about the idea of inspiration. Last class next time, and we're going to pull it all together. Okay. Remember, now is your time.